Great. So welcome everyone to our third and final event for our High Tide speaker series for the 2024 winter high water season. We've been hosting a series of speakers around the high tides this season with the goal to gather folks along the coast to discuss and observe the changes to our coastline to better understand the implications of coastal flooding and sea level rise on our communities. So we had one in March and February. My name is Abigail. I'm on the education team at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. I'm joined by my colleague Maggie, who's going to also help monitor the chat. So please put any questions or comments into the Q&A or into the chat. So if your question isn't answered right away, we'll definitely follow up after this session. The topic of today's conversation is informing decision-making, and we're lucky to be joined by our One Climate Future team, which is a joint team from Portland and South Portland sustainability offices. So you have Troy Moon and Katie Timms from the city of Portland and Julie Rosenbach from the city of South Portland. And they'll share a bit about their coastal flooding related efforts. In addition to our speakers, all of you have joined as experts and members from your own communities, many of you who likely take an active role in your community. So I'm super excited to hear all of your questions and comments as well. All right. Oops. So just to go over a few plans for today, we're going to do a quick introduction of the Coastal Flooding Community Science Project, go over some upcoming events and how to get involved, and then I'll pass it over to the speakers for a quick presentation and open up the rest of the time for Q&A. So again, any questions or comments into the Q&A section. All right, so to start, just wanted to give a brief overview of our Coastal Flooding Community Science Project, which is an action that you can take in your own communities to understand the impacts of coastal flooding and sea level rise. So the Coastal Flooding Community Science Project is a community or citizen science project where folks take photos and make observations in their community. The goal of the project is to gather local data, increase community engagement and awareness of flood vulnerabilities, and inform local and regional decision making. This past January, many of us may have experienced some devastating impacts of coastal flooding as we saw storms hit our coastal communities. And many of us may have also experienced coastal flooding on sunny days in February and March as astronomical high tides brought some pretty high water further onto our shores. So it's our goal that with this project, participants can experience a sense of purpose, empowerment, and connection to their community to further our collective coastal resilience. So it's exciting to see we have a range of folks on this call and folks who have registered and participated in this project. The map I have pulled up here shows places that are already involved in the Coastal Flooding Community Science Project. And these communities have established monitoring sites where we expect to gather observations of coastal flooding during predicted high tides and storms. With that being said, we need help from everyone along the coastline, so you can choose a site in one of these pinned communities or make observations elsewhere. And all of these observations, whether you see flooding or not, are super important to understanding the coastline. So here are some plans for this month. We're meeting today to talk about informing decision-making and get super energized to then go out and make observations. The highest predicted high tides of the month are from April 8th to the 12th. So those are the key days to go outside and make observations. April 8th is also the eclipse, so that might be really cool to get outside as well. So if conditions are safe, I encourage everyone to go out, bring a buddy, bring some friends, family, neighbors, classmates. The high tides this month are a bit unique from the last 2 months where they fall around midnight. So unless you're super highly motivated, I'm not encouraging anybody to go out at midnight, but you can also make observations the next day of high water mark. So things like debris, wreck lines, signs of erosions, things like that. So we could see where the water may have reached the night before. So during these days, go outside, make some observations, have some conversations, submit your data to the Coastal Flooding Community Science Project. We also have a few partners and participating communities that are hosting coastal meetups. Folks from Herring Gut in St. George and Portland Trails in Portland are hosting coastal meetups, and I'll send some links to those in the follow-up. And then following these high tides, we're going to join all back together again on April 23rd at noon to discuss what you've observed. So it's a great chance to just connect with others and share out your own experiences during this month. So again, I'll follow up with an email with the dates and times of the high tides, the links to the coastal flooding project page that includes some details and information on data collection. And then I'll also send out a list of the coastal meetups that are happening over the time period. For the Q&A today, we're going to prioritize the question to our speakers. So any kind of logistics, we can follow up and you can follow up with me on those. So with that, I'm going to send it over to our speakers. I think we'll start with Troy and Katie from Portland and then go on to Julie.
Thanks, Abigail. Nice to be here. Nice to see everyone around the state. I actually had the opportunity to jump on a meeting with a Climate to Thrive who was down on MDI yesterday. So it's good to see some Bar Harbor folks. So I'm going to run through a few slides quickly. So everyone likes pictures, including me, and kind of frame some of the conversation. Abigail, can you see the slides? Perfect. Great. So we're all really aware of what's happening with tides recently. Here's a picture from January 13th at one of our local establishments, Jay's Oyster Bar. You can see the water is really, really high. This was an example of the highest tide ever recorded in Portland, and we have a number of pictures that we'll look at from that day. It was definitely a wake-up call. The previous high tide we experienced was in 1978, and this one is quite a bit higher. And so definitely got people talking both in Portland and up and down the coast, and also inland. So we have a few thoughts about what's going on. If I can find it, there we go. So again, we mentioned that Portland and South Portland have a joint climate action plan. It's called One Climate Future. It was adopted in 2020 by both of our city councils. We look at areas to reduce carbon emissions 80% by 2050 in our buildings and our energy systems. We want to become zero waste communities. We want to de-emphasize automobiles and transition other vehicles to electricity. And we also importantly want to think about climate resilience. How do we adapt to the impacts of climate change that we know are coming? And so why do we want to do this? This is, it's pretty clear now that burning fossil fuels emits carbon, so greenhouse gas emissions that are raising our global temperature, which leads to sea level rise here on the coast of Maine and around the world. So what can we do? What are we doing in our plans to reduce those emissions? So we're doing solar wherever we can. We're electrifying cars and buses, working to retrofit old buildings to be, away from burning oil and gas to electricity, reducing waste, and working on our homes. So these are all things that, that we're doing here in Portland, South Portland, and I know many people are doing in their communities as well. One of the things that's kind of problematic as we plan and prepare is we don't really know like how much sea level rise we're going to be impacted by. So we have to come up with a plan to prepare for. So our plan in One Climate Future prepares us. We want to commit to manage like almost 1.5 feet of sea level rise by 2050 and getting almost 4 feet of sea level rise by 2100. But that's based on the intermediate scenarios. We're hoping that is as high as it gets. But we have to be aware that as carbon emissions continue and we see glaciers melting and oceans warming, it's leading to more sea level rise. So we have, it could very well be that we get more sea level rise than that. So, we are aware that we could see, as much as 10 or 11 feet by 2100, which would be pretty catastrophic. Again, just a reminder quickly of what we were seeing. Here's another view of Portland Pier on January 13th. Interestingly enough, this is, if you think about, tide is about 4 feet higher than what we normally expect. So theoretically, this is maybe what you would see on Portland Pier in 2100 if we go with that intermediate sea level rise scenario. So that's a really different waterfront than we currently have. So that's kind of what we're thinking about as we move forward. And then just quickly run through a couple other spots were impacted. So if you know Portland, this is on like going out of Congress Street on the way to the jetport. It wasn't a good day to go to the jetport. Our island communities, like many island communities around up and down the coast, were severely impacted. So here's some pictures on the left from Peaks Island, our Seashore Avenue on Peaks, which is the back shore that faces the open ocean, was completely kind of removed. Over a mile of that road was devastated. Our barge landing on Cliff Island on the right was also heavily damaged. So we're making some repairs. In Willard, in South Portland, many people, were concerned that the historic fishing shacks were washed out to sea. So again, impacts all around. Here's another picture of Bayside in Portland. But also, Abigail and Maggie noted, sunny day flooding. We're seeing more and more of this. So here's just a couple weeks ago, March 13th, I just happened to be down on Portland Pier. I'm like, what? And here we have 11.26 foot tide on a beautiful sunny afternoon. And we're seeing more and more of this as sea levels rise. We have to be mindful of this. So what can individuals do? So one of the things that we're working with Gulf of Maine Research Institute on is a citizen science initiative. As Abigail and Maggie noted, we're trying to collect data from all times. It doesn't have to be just during a storm event. It could be anytime. We're trying to create a data set and document conditions that we can observe changes over time, that scientists like those at Gulf of Maine Research Institute and other places can evaluate the changes, see what's going on, and use that information in their data sets. But also, importantly, it helps municipal planners like us in Portland and South Portland think about how to prepare for the future of sea level rise. So we want to think about where is it safe to build buildings. We need to make policies about what's safe to construct, how should buildings be constructed moving forward, and how do we make sure that we're continuing to develop our communities and have economic activity, but only in a way that's prepared for what we know, the sea level rise, and as well as other climate impacts that we know are coming. So one thing we're looking at is creating new zoning rules about like how high the base floor of new buildings should be. And we want to make sure that any buildings that are in this red area, this is a map of Portland, and you can see this is the red areas are where we anticipate would be inundated in 2100 if there were a 100-year storm. So our new zoning rules are about making sure that anyone who builds things in those areas are safe. So critical uses like residential, properties, hotels, etc., have to be elevated above those heights. Where other uses that maybe are more resilient, particularly like marine uses, wouldn't have the same rules. So it'll be easier to build buildings and properties and piers and on the waterfront that are designed to interface with the water. So that's, by using observations, we can help inform those decisions. And certainly we want to also make sure we're reducing flooding in other areas. So more stormwater management techniques. So here's a rain garden at the University of Southern Maine here in Portland. We're working on things like these rain gardens in Sagamore Village in Portland. So how can we know that more and more stormwater is coming from more intense storms. We want to catch the water and manage it in place in things like this rain garden. And we also want to make sure that we're protecting the working waterfront. For Portland and South Portland, the marine industry, the blue economy is really important to us historically, but also economically. So how can we make sure that we're preparing for making sure that these fishing vessels and other marine operators are able to access deep water ports and are preparing themselves for sea level rise? Because it's going to be a partnership, certainly, between city governments as well as the people who own a lot of this infrastructure. There's only a certain a toolbox of options people have that they can use to address sea level rise impacts. Certainly you can try to avoid it if you're a use that can build higher. That's great. Or if you can manage to I'm going to let my first floor get wet, maybe be parking, and we'll move other things upstairs. You can try to build, in some places you can build seawalls or protection. But unfortunately, in some cases, people may decide that that's really difficult for them to continue operating on a waterfront, and maybe they'd be better served if they relocated to higher ground. And ultimately, if people make those choices, we'll think about how do we redevelop properties on the waterfront in ways that advance resilience, but potentially maybe even focus on marine uses where they want to be on the water or need to be on the waterfront to do their work. But all in all, it's going to be lots of conversations, lots of collaboration, and lots of hard decisions, both in the private and the public sectors. We certainly, emergency preparedness is key for any municipal government. We want to make sure that we're helping people during emergencies. We think we have there's like residential properties on the waterfront. We're having conversations with them to make sure that they can access emergency services. And we're working really closely with neighbors to have conversations like this and to think about how we can develop community resilience and prepare all of ourselves for the changes that are coming in sea level rise, and as well as the other impacts that we anticipate. So I hope I didn't go too long with slides, but happy to take questions too. Stop share.
Thanks, Troy. We could either take a few questions now or just move to Julie to speak for a little bit.
I have a quick question. For the rain gardens, I don't know what the salinity is along that area in Portland. I'm not from that area. And is that a factor with the plant choices for the native plants that you're putting in?
So it has to be always, not just because it's on the coast, but also because it's on a road. And so we have winter operations, and so they put down lots of salt. And so we have to think about that when we're choosing plants for rain gardens and that sort of thing.
Any other questions directly for Troy? All right, we'll move to Julie then.
Katie, did you have, I think maybe we should do Katie and then move to me, if that's okay with you.
I didn't necessarily have a ton to add. I'm here to help answer questions, but Troy, you covered a fantastic job.
But if we want to chat, if we didn't really talk too much about the Sustainable Neighborhoods program, if you want to chime in about that.
Yeah, definitely. So we, as the city of Portland, we last year launched a Sustainable Neighborhoods program. And if you don't know anything about what I'm mentioning, it's a program where we are really looking at ways that the city can help build social resilience. It's increasingly important as we are just facing more extreme storms, but also it's a huge part of sustainability as a whole. We need to work together to solve a lot of these problems, sea level rise just being one of them. And knowing your neighbors is it's something we are really here trying to support. And so we are looking for ways to collaborate with residents and citizens, and that's one of the ways we're the citizen science coastal flooding program that GMRI is hosting. We're happy we're happy to collaborate with them because it's a fantastic way to get citizens involved in thinking about coastal flooding and really thinking about the ways that we can all adapt. And I
Yeah. And so one of the cool things about the citizen science piece is that people can do it as a group together. You can do it as a family. You can have some groups of friends, because one of the key things about the Sustainable Neighborhoods program is to develop connections between people who, in neighborhoods, to develop that, to create more social bonds, more opportunities to connect, to develop just a history of doing things together and building those social connections, because we know that in communities where there's this high level of social cohesion, they have better outcomes when there's an emergency or crisis, and they recover more quickly. Because people want to help their people. People are more apt to help people they know and have a relationship with. And so, and you know, as climate change becomes more impactful and we experience more events, there are often times when, you know, the first responders are your neighbors or yourself. Before, you know, if power lines are down and there's a crisis, you know, neighbors helping neighbors is more and more important, just to be able to, you know, build those connections and make, you know, so people are more apt to do that. That's kind of like a key goal of sustainable neighborhoods.
Julie, we couldn't really hear you before.
Hear me now?
It's a little muffled.
All right.
I don't know if it's the mask or just the microphone.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me just make sure. Okay, is that better? Okay. So, thank you, Troy. I feel like Troy really covered a large amount of what we've been doing with One Climate Future in his fantastic presentation. I don't have pictures or a PowerPoint to share with you, but I just wanted to give you my thoughts about resilience and decision-making and the role of community science. So this whole notion, even several years ago, people were doing climate action plans to mitigate the impact of greenhouse gas emissions. Like, how do we, you know, cut down on the use of fossil fuels in order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change? And, you know, a little bit later on, like up to a few years ago, we started looking at our climate action plans as climate action and adaptation plans. Because we know that we can mitigate all we want, but that we have in fact already changed our climate and we're seeing the effects right now, and they will only be exacerbated in the future. So, so this whole new, well, new to a lot of us field of climate resilience, you know, has taken hold. But for many of us, it's a brand new way to look at things, right? We know how to approach getting off of fossil fuels, and we're working at it as ambitiously and as we can. This whole undertaking of making our communities more resilient is more of a stepwise process to me, and we need to build each building block as we go along, because there aren't solutions that we could just jump into immediately. And so, you know, we worked with Portland. Well, we've been working with Portland and GMRI for years, and I'm so grateful for that partnership because it is fantastic. Originally, we worked with the, it's called the Maine Silver Jackets. It's FEMA and NOAA and the Army Corps of Engineers, along with Maine state agencies, to look at, we placed high water mark signs across Portland and South Portland. And we said, hey, our last big storm that we benchmark a lot of things to was a storm of 1978. Here's where the water was on the coast. And, you know, with the sea level rise that we are anticipating, here's where that same type of storm, where the water is going to be. And those signs are in several locations throughout the cities, and they've made a really big impact, right? Our band of uncertainty is, you know, fairly large, but you can see that it is well beyond where the storm of 78 was. And so the first piece of the building block is, hey, we need to get everybody's attention that, especially in South Portland, where we traditionally haven't had sunny day flooding, how do we tell people that this is something that is going to be a huge thing to prepare for? In some ways, I don't know, I was going to say that you're lucky in Portland that you have some precursors, but I don't think that's the right way to frame it. But people can get a sense of what's happening incrementally. we've always said in South Portland, hey, sea level rise, you know, we don't have a lot of flooding right now, but when we get the flooding, it'll be here, and we won't be able to escape it. So the first piece is getting people's attention that this is something that we need to start working on. The second piece was working with the Silver Jackets, particularly the Army Corps of Engineers, to establish this dynamic inundation flood model to say, yep, we know we're going to have sea level rise, but we also know that we're going to have more frequent, more intense storms. And so what is water going to look like when we have those storms? And so the Army Corps developed those dynamic maps for Portland and South Portland and Damariscotta. Once we had those maps, so this is another building block. Once we had those maps, they were sitting as GIS files on my computer, and I was like, I'm not a GIS person. So we got a grant, and we worked with GMRI and a couple of others to turn those dynamic GIS maps into a story map to show people what is it going to look like under this scenario with this type of storm. And you can play around and you can toggle things on and off to see what the impacts are that we're expecting. The second piece of that grant is what we're still working on right now, and that is to take that information. This is another piece of the building block. Take that information and really share it with people to educate people as we're making decisions on policy. And so the second piece of that is using this information to update well, we're in the process of updating our comprehensive plan, but really putting this information into our comprehensive plan. Some of the tools that we used in addition to the story map are we're to partner with GMRI on the citizen science. We held 4 coastal walks, and we held 3 workshops to take people through and say, you know what they say, all models are wrong, some are just a bit more accurate. And so the citizen science piece is, I think there's 2 really important parts to it. The first is to ground truth the models that we have. And I hear that all the time from Abigail and Gail. We absolutely need to ground truth these models. The second, though, is to get people out there, get people connecting with their coastline and being a part of the science that we're looking at in order to take some ownership and have some agency in the decision-making process. So these are 2 really big pieces of the work that we're doing. And again, that builds that agency with that building block. Once we have those, then we start making the policy decisions about how we want to build, where we want to build. We are, there's funding that's about to be approved in our FY25 budget to do a similar resilience overlay zoning that Portland has done. And it's going to be a big public process. Do we want to allow people to build anywhere and everywhere, but tell them what they can and can't build? Do we want to hold some places off and say, we don't think there should be development here? This is going to be part science of climate change and dynamic flood inundation, and part public policy and what people want to see and how they want to manage things. And so these are all the different ways that we're working on stepping ourselves into climate resilience. I have a massive spreadsheet, and I'm trying to make it into just a 1-page sort of PDF, sit down and talk to people about, with each building block and what each building block contributes to the bigger picture of how we build resilience. And we need all of those pieces, and sometimes we need them in a certain order, but yeah, so that's what I would share with everybody.
Thanks, Julie. It's really interesting too to point out the difference between Portland and South Portland, even just right across the harbor. There's so many differences, and why it's so important that we have all this information from up the coast, because there's a lot of variability. All right, so we have about 15 minutes for some questions. We already have a few that have come in, so I can start there, and then as people think of questions, you could just message them to me or to Maggie. First question is, what are some examples of the possible uses of the downtown areas that are susceptible to flooding? So Troy, you mentioned that maybe like for marine affairs or fisheries, but what might be some specific examples?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think, certainly in the next, couple decades, I mean, probably the makeup of the waterfront won't be all that different. We'll be seeing more nuisance flooding, certainly, but things won't probably be so different, hopefully over the next couple of decades but over time, I think we're going to see evolution as on the water side of commercial, particularly. I expect, already, most of a good chunk of the waterfront is already zoned for marine uses. So that'll certainly continue. But some of the other, restaurants, storefronts, offices, in 20 years or so may find that, accessing property through frequent nuisance flooding might not be something that they want to continue doing. So there could be evolutions to the types of uses. And again, with the zoning ordinances we're anticipating being adopted, it'll be much easier to develop marine infrastructure than it will be for housing or retail on the water side of Commercial Street. So I think that would influence some of the decision making as well. But a lot of fishing vessels, food, seafood processing, loading, unloading, they need to be on the water to do their work. So they're going to continue to do that. Other uses don't need to be on the waterfront. It's just sort of nice. So again, it's just going to be ultimately making decisions about what level of risk you're comfortable with as a property owner and what level of nuisance you can tolerate and still do your business.
Thanks. I also just dropped in the chat the map that you shared.
Yeah, so just like the map that Abigail just dumped into the chat is it's interactive map viewer, and it's based on, we also have a similar model as South Portland did the same project. So this is actually probably the best data on the main coast. So Portland Harbor on the Portland and South Portland side, we have the most detailed maps of where sea level rise is going to be impacting. So it's 1 meter resolution. And it takes into account topography, currents, wave action. Is very, very complex. But you're invited to dive into it. It's it takes a while to load because it gets so much data, but you can really dive very close in to see where we think things will be most impacted by 2100. So.
We had another question that asks, have state or federal emergency funds been useful with this work?
So the work we're doing immediately, not so much. I mean, certainly we've all benefited from, FEMA disaster, relief and that sort of, and, we continue to work on opportunities to find grant funding to do resilience projects. We're looking for opportunities and we recently, Portland and South Portland, collaborated on a grant to help us think about how to design resilient infrastructure on the seacoast. Unfortunately, we weren't successful, but we're continuing to work with state and federal partners because I think there's a lot of value in thinking about, particularly how can we engage like living shoreline, natural solutions on our waterfronts. A lot of what we have is already got seawalls, but what can we do in the intertidal zone to reduce wave action, reduce energy flow in the water that can limit damage to infrastructure. So those are things we're thinking a lot about, and we're going to continue to talk with both the state DEP and emergency management folks as well as feds to continue to do that work.
I would just add that there's an enormous amount of funding right now for adaptation and resilience projects. But it's really competitive. And so, like Troy said, we applied for that NOAA grant. We didn't get invited to to submit a full application. The state of Maine applied for it though, and they're applying for a huge grant, $75 million, to do similar stuff, to look at community, like projects by community, to look at DEP permitting and what process needs to change, because I think there are some constraints with current permitting, and so it's sort of like at different levels. But I think that the federal funding is it's a bit of a challenge to get, and it takes a lot of time and energy to apply for. So I just want to make sure people know that caveat.
We had another question come in that was, do you have any recommendations for houses or buildings that are close to the shoreline where the water has come up in recent storms? And like what would be most effective, cost effective, any strategies like that?
Yeah, I don't have any particular ideas. Again, the choices are, somewhat limited. I mean, as a homeowner, it's difficult you can't really build a seawall. So yeah, it's really tough. And I know some people are struggling with, being able to access flood insurance. So yeah, I don't have any particular guidance, unfortunately. Just, conversations with your town, if there's any programs available. But a lot of it, it's conversations I've had with Portland property owners. They want to know, talking more about what our climate vulnerability assessment says, learning what we're anticipating to have for sea level rise, as they, know that they have decisions they need to make about their private property. So that's what we can share, is a data that we collect ourselves and with partners like GMRI. And then certainly we're going to continue to look for grant opportunities for, to create more resilience in public infrastructure as well as private property. But a lot of the interventions can be very, very costly. So having access to federal funds would be a big help for sure. So.
Great, we have about 5 more minutes. Are there any other questions? I'm interested in what you found to be the most effective way to communicate with others about coastal flooding, sea level rise.
Do you want to go, Julie?
Well, first of all, I think there's no one silver bullet. I think different people react to a lot of different things. We put up those high water mark signs at Willard Beach and along the green belt and at Buckley Park, and so people took notice, particularly the one at Willard. People took notice, but I'm sure we got oh wow, look at that. And then I think it's just multiple layers of different types of outreach, because then when the storm hit, people were like, wow, well, first of all, look at the effects of the storm. I mean, nothing mobilized South Portland more than the fishing shacks, floating out to sea. And so that wasn't outreach and engagement that we'd like to see, but it really got people to understand the severity of what we're trying to deal with, and B, understand that there are policy mechanisms in addition to, nature-based solutions and gray infrastructure projects that we can be looking at in order to become more resilient.
So in Portland, I'd say, because we have had sunny day flooding for some time, and we see pretty significant impacts from flooding periodically, that's kind of maybe been on our minds a lot more. So there's been groups that have had king tide parties for the last 10 years. I think it's really on people's minds, and and we don't have to try that hard to strike up a conversation about the flooding part. I'm actually more concerned about making sure we strike up conversations about other impacts beyond sea level rise, including like what are we going to do with more high heat days? How are we going to manage more intense rainfalls? And, what is that going to do? How do we improve our stormwater infrastructure to be able to manage that? And so those ultimately are going to be conversations about budget. In terms of at least on the infrastructure side is how do we upsize storm drains and the sewer system. So that's something that our public officials are going to need to invest in. So that will involve lots of communication with members of the public so they know what they're buying, so to speak, with those investments. And then just having conversations with members of the public, kind of like what Katie was talking about with our Sustainable Neighborhoods program. What can people in their neighborhoods do to make their own properties and their own neighborhoods resilient for our climate change?
All right, the final question I will leave you with is, what are some of your thoughts on the role of youth in this work?
I'll jump in. I think that youth are vitally important. We're talking about a future that young people are going to be living in, and there's so many great youth leaders in Maine that hats off. I mentioned the Climate to Thrive event I was at yesterday, and it was led by a senior at the College of the Atlantic, and she and other peers have such strong voices and have so much to contribute, and I think it's really important that we make space and other people who've been around a while like myself make sure that we make space and listen to input and the voices of young people. I'm really excited that in my office and in Julie's office we have young people on our teams, and they bring so much to our work, and we couldn't do it without them.
Absolutely, with everything Troy said. Also, there's a particularly great role for youth doing community science. I mean, I feel like in Maine, our youth are already connected in so many ways to the outdoors, to the environment around them, and really get out there. And so, you don't have to be a grown-up to be a community scientist.
Great. Well, we'll end on that wonderful message. Thanks everyone again for joining. We'll join back again on April 23rd at 12 p.m. To share a bit about what we saw this month. From April 8th to April 12th is the high water that's predicted for this month. Again, it's at midnight, so recommend going out the day after and looking for high water marks. And then you can submit that to the Coastal Funding Community Science Project. And I will follow up with all of these links and any of the links that were shared in the meeting today. So thank you all and have a great rest of your days.